Why did nobody tell me that my FX camera can now record Sony RAW internally? I was very surprised to see that when I load my S-Log3 footage into the latest version of DaVinci Resolve, open the Camera Raw tab, all the picture controls of internal RAW are there. Look, it even calls it Sony RAW. How did I not know about this? Can't be real, can it? I think this all started with a recent update to DaVinci Resolve 18. And amazingly, it looks like we now have all the non-destructive control of exposure, color temperature, contrast, sharpness. In fact, all of the precise controls you'd normally see on a real RAW recording. So much so, they've even called it Sony RAW. But it's not actually RAW, is it? If you think about it, all cameras shoot RAW at some point. It's just the luminance data from each photo site behind the colour filter array. And amazingly, years ago, Red obtained a patent for recording compressed RAW internally. I know. But that's why the rest of us have had to do it with external recorders ever since. As a side note, Nikon recently challenged the legality of Red's patent in court. A secret agreement was reached, and the Nikon Z9 can continue to record RAW internally. So maybe that's the start of a sensible breakthrough. Sorry to butt in from the future here, but literally while I'm editing this video, I've just heard that Nikon have bought Red, which is huge. Also goes some way to answering the question I was just about to ask. I've got no idea what this means for the industry. I hope it's a good thing. Now, where were we? So what's this Sony RAW tab that's just appeared on the colour page of Resolve? On the face of it, we get all of the RAW control, but using XAVC footage. It looks very impressive, and is surprisingly accurate. I don't see how Blackmagic could offer this much control without working very closely with Sony. It's not just about reading metadata. It's also like reverse engineering the response curve of S-Log3 recorded as XAVC data. So obviously what I wanted to do was compare this fake Sony RAW with real ProRes RAW, recorded from the same Sony FX camera. I recorded a test shot correctly exposed, and that's 18% grey at 41% luminance for S-Log3. I then recorded the same shot 3 and 5 stops overexposed and 3 and 5 stops underexposed. I thought it would be interesting to see how well we could recover these pictures to something usable, using fake Sony RAW versus real ProRes RAW. And I should point out that what we're testing here is not dynamic range. That's fundamentally a function of the camera's sensor. This is more like exposure latitude, which is related but different. Anyway, we've got two immediate problems with running this comparison. Firstly, by its nature, RAW doesn't have any noise reduction. So I could either turn off the noise reduction on the internal recording in camera, or add a little noise reduction to the imported RAW footage to match within Resolve. I went with the second option because you'd have to add a little noise reduction to RAW anyway. And I'm not sure what making everything more noisy would demonstrate. The second issue is that DaVinci Resolve won't import ProRes RAW. I have no idea if this incompatibility between Apple and Blackmagic formats is caused by licensing, finances, protectionism, or even egos. I can't see how anyone wins. Anyway, I wish somebody would knock Tim Cook and Grant Petty's heads together. For now, I have to convert my ProRes RAW HQ files to uncompressed Cinema DNG. I use a program called Assimilate Studio, which was on offer when I purchased my Atomos Ninja, but there's a cheaper program called RAW Converter, which also does the same job. I'll put a link to both below. Cinema DNG is still what I'd call a real RAW format, so this comparison should still be valid. It doesn't take long to convert all of my RAW footage and import those shots into Resolve. But this highlights another issue. Obviously, the XAVC footage has been recorded in the S-Gamut3 Cine color space with S-Log3 gamma curves. But importing Cinema DNG into Resolve doesn't give us that color space option. If we want to compare apples with apples, we're going to have to convert Cinema DNG with a color space transform into the same S-Log3 Cine as the XAVC footage. I found the best input settings on the Camera RAW tab for Cinema DNG to be a color space of P3D60 and set the gamma to linear. Then, on the first node of your Cinema DNG footage, set up a color space transform. We're now moving from an input color space of P3D60 and an input gamma that's linear. Obviously, we want an output color space of Sony S-Gamut3 Cine and an output gamma of Sony S-Log3. It's important to set the tone mapping method to none, and the gamma mapping method should switch to none as well. What you'll now get is a matching S-Log3 Cine image from both your XAVC footage and the imported RAW files. The second node on the RAW shots was a very basic level of noise reduction, and it closely matched the XAVC shots at the correct exposure. I didn't alter the noise reduction settings on any of the shots from this initial level. So that I can see what I'm doing, I also put the same S-Log3 to LC709 Type A LUT as the last node on all of the footage. Well, it's the last node on the RAW and the only node on the XAVC. From now on, all of my adjustments were made using just the Camera RAW tab, which is at the very beginning of the chain for both the XAVC Fake RAW and the Cinema DNG Real RAW. Comparing the two images shot at the correct exposure, it's very difficult to tell them apart. All of the RAW controls work in much the same way, and if anything, I found it slightly easier to set up the Sony RAW than the Cinema DNG. You might be able to spot a very slight colour shift, particularly in the blues. You can see it on the wall behind me and on the blue chips on the colour checker. I went back and I double-checked using Final Cut and the original ProRes RAW files. I can definitely still see a similar colour shift in the blues, albeit to a much smaller degree, and I don't know if this is caused by the extra 2 bits of colour depth in 12-bit RAW, the noise reduction, or even the conversion to Cinema DNG, but whatever it is, it's very easy to correct, although I didn't bother for the purpose of this test. When looking at the footage shot 3 stops over, it's still very difficult to spot the difference between XAVC and RAW. Neither had much trouble correcting, and they're probably both usable if you had to. At 5 stops over, the quality in the clipped highlights is definitely dropping, and there's that Sony magenta cast to the warm areas on skin tones. I still can't see much of a difference between the XAVC and the RAW files. They seem to handle in the same way and produce much the same result. Let's look at the files exposed 3 stops under. Well, clearly we're going to get a lot more noise from the shadows, and even the XAVC file is going to need some noise reduction. I'm not sure this would ever be usable, but it's much the same story with RAW. However, the colour shift is now more pronounced than before, and my shirt has even gone a bit green. This might be coloured noise in the shadows, but I'm also seeing more saturation overall, even in the brighter skin tones. And the 5 stops under is just a joke. You can see that the original footage at the top left looks completely black before correction. I'm amazed we've even been able to recover anything from the XAVC file. The RAW file is interesting. It's obviously just as unusable, but we can see considerably more colour information that we've been able to recover. It might not be the right colour, but there's definitely more of it. So I thought I'd try the same test again, but this time recording with the wrong colour balance. I lit with daylight lamps, but set the camera to 3200 degree Kelvin tungsten. Now the XAVC starts to look a bit wonky. Even at the correct exposure, the colours are difficult to get right. I'm sure a professional colourist would be able to dial in something usable, but it's not very pleasing to the eye and not easy to correct using just the RAW controls. Now the real RAW starts to shine, and this is almost usable without any further correction. Is this the extra bits of colour depth, or just the fact that we're recording more data? Plus 3 stops at the wrong colour is much the same story, and the RAW is definitely showing an advantage here. Minus 3 stops is just exaggerating the problem, with a lot more noise, although with a bit more noise reduction in the RAW, it might actually be usable in an emergency. I've also been looking at real-world pictures as well, trying to find images that clip the highlights or push the shadows, and as long as you've got the colour balance close and haven't completely mucked up the exposure by more than, say, 3 stops, it's very difficult to spot the picture quality difference between fake Sony RAW and real RAW, even on a true 10-bit screen. When I started to make this video, I fully expected to be able to ridicule Sony's fake RAW in DaVinci Resolve. I thought it would be a cheap marketing trick, but no. I find these controls really useful, particularly if you're not a professional colorist, which I'm clearly not. What these tests have shown me is how good XAVC really is. And obviously, if we were comparing 16-bit linear RAW, I'm sure this would be a completely different story, but 12-bit ProRes RAW? Now I'm not so sure what the point is. Thanks for watching.